you know, and I won't talk too much about this. One of the things we were successful in this agency of doing was saying the kids must be educated outside of a cell. You cannot do that. And so they decided what they would do is handcuff him. So here you see a kid who's trying to do his math, and he actually became, there's only so many things you can do, but he became pretty adept at using, you can see a little calculator, and he's just like, how he managed to kind of become an adept student. So just going to give you an overview. Typically, one of the, you know, of course, I'm sure you all know, the overrepresentation of minority students in these settings is pretty severe. But also, there's a huge overrepresentation of students with disabilities. And this is just from one state, Texas. And you can see this is just showing you the percentage of white students, black students, Latino students, and then others. The top half of that bar is the percentage of those kids in special education. Here it was about 40, I think about 40%. The typical public school system, you know, really has about 12, 15%. This 40% is a major underrepresentation, because what happens in these settings is if they don't get an IEP, that kid is not in special education. End of story, we're done. So despite there being laws requiring them to find and seek kids with disabilities, I've actually never seen that occur. And then this just shows you the types of, this is from Maryland, so we kind of did a big project about 600 kids who are incarcerated in Maryland. And this is by disability category. The thing here is just to look at, this is the percentage of the kids in special education, so students who, at the time, this would be intellectual disabilities now, but at the time when COVID was mental retardation. 1.6% of the special ed students are identified as having mental retardation, and they represent 0.4% of the population. And for me, the striking pieces are this, the emotional disturbance, which is kids with really any mental health, behavioral, emotional issues. This group in our population in this state represents about 1.1% of the population, but in the prison represents about 20%. And again, I would say that's an underrepresentation. You have more kids with pretty severe mental health problems. I would say you probably get 85 or 90% of those kids with pretty serious mental health. We interviewed all those kids just to get a sense of what their history had been with regards to participation therapy, use of psychotropic medications. And these, again, are pretty, in order for them to have been counted as a yes in this, they had to not only say, I had psychotropic medications, they had to name it. And so a lot of the kids would say, yes, I did, but they didn't. We didn't have records, and you know, we didn't have anything you can go and double check. So if they weren't able to say it was this medication, they didn't count. So many more kids reported that they had been on medications, but if you are familiar with the names of most of these medications, and you know, most clinicians have trouble remembering these multi-syllabic names. Nonetheless, a high percentage reporting participation in therapy prior to getting here, a high percent psychotropic medications. This is interesting because after coming, we see pretty much no participation in therapy. So the idea of providing mental health services is eliminated under the guise of we provide a supportive environment. All things are therapeutic, and it's a real problem. And unfortunately, what also happens, and in Texas, this happened all the time, kids would come in and the psychiatrist, who was the only psychiatrist for the state in the system, when a kid came in with any psychotropic medication, he said, we take them off of everything. Not we wean them off, not that we try to find a better, more stable system, but take them off. And so that boy you saw had been on 5 medications prior to getting there, had gone on to this, and within a week was in what they call the regression management program for 15 months. And then just, you know, this is just the percentages of the various medications. So you're seeing, you know, really high percentages of antipsychotics, bipolar medications, antidepressants, and of course a high percentage of ADHD medications. And a lot of the kids were on multiple, 60%, 45% were on more than one medication. This, I should put this after here. Just another piece, so we're talking about education. This is their performance. So we did assessments using the Woodcock-Johnson on reading and math. I'm only going to talk about reading, but these are the mean scores. So you're seeing the top line is general education, the bottom line is special education, and this is by racial subgroup. So, you know, just to talk about this group, we have in general education, these are the African American students. So we have a mean of about, I don't know, 83. For the white students, it's about 92. The overall population is about 85, and this is in reading comprehension. And pretty far below for special education, which you may expect, but the depressed scores, I mean, these scores, the mean and the standard deviation and the distribution all look normal. They just look like they're slid down. So it really is like a different population of kids, all of them. You know, we don't have any remarkably high readers. We don't have a tail going off to the right, which says, oh, it's a normal distribution, just more kids over here. In fact, it's a totally normal distribution, with the highest being just into the upper average range. And they're consistent. This is word identification, meaning the ability to read words. This is decoding. So for all of them, you're seeing relatively low scores. And then this is just to talk about the disciplinary practices. And this is something I'm actually working on right now. I'm working on a paper with Jason and with a group of students, where we've been looking at the numbers of incidents that kids have, and then the numbers of times that they're moved into seclusion, and how much time they spend in seclusion. And it's really, it's pretty shocking that, you know, as I started this and kind of been looking at the information, this isn't something I looked too closely at before in terms of the research, but there's actually no studies about this. So once a kid is in prison, we don't actually know how many times are they subject to disciplinary consequences. What are those disciplinary consequences? And there's a lot of, you know, you'll get a lot of information because agencies are often sued for what they're called abusive practices or excessive use of force. But, you know, what doesn't get usually added into here is extensive periods of time in isolation. So you're putting a kid into a prison away from their home, away from their community, away from their support system, and then you lock them into a cell. You know, it really, I mean, I think that it looks about the same as any other type of abuse. I mean, you get increases amounts of depressive symptoms, increased anxiety. You'll get kids who become extremely distraught. You get kids who begin to self-harm, even if they had no history of self-harm before. So really troubling. And again, we see kind of the same pattern, which is, so these are just looking at essentially just a relative risk ratio across races. And so and by disability category, again, what happens is, you know, invariably, minority students are overrepresented in numbers of incidents, special education students are overrepresented, and kind of combination of race and disability just is, it really is like an additive piece. You know, if I'm African American and I have a disability, I can pretty much count on spending a lot of time getting in trouble and being in isolation. And one of the problems here is that there's just very little examination of this. Nobody looks at this and nobody says, you know, there is no monitoring agency coming in saying, are you disproportionately, essentially like suspending kids in this institution like this? Nobody does that. There is no system in place for that. And the agency could really, I think, care less. And so I just really wanted to talk, I'm perfect on time, right? I got three quick...
you have 2 minutes.
Perfect. Three quick overall recommendations. Number one, with regards to mental health, what needs to happen is, number one, there needs to be an intake review of all records. This doesn't happen. So kids arrive, and what happens is we start over again. We always assume this is a new kid. If records come in, they usually are rejected. And you would think then that that would lead to a psychiatric intake. No, generally not. So, you know, in Texas, which is the second largest system it's the second largest state, so it's not surprising it's the second largest system, juvenile justice system, but they had one psychiatrist. And at any given time, there are 2,600 kids locked up there. Over the course of a year, that's probably closer to 6,000 or 7,000 kids who are being locked up. There's one psychiatrist there. So what happens is they just see a quote-unquote clinician, they'll talk to him a little bit, and the psychiatrist takes care of just filing paperwork, and it's an office. But what needs to happen is an actual psychiatric intake. Really a very close examination of what's going on, with a thought to the fact that these kids are just incarcerated. Many of them have never been incarcerated before. This is not going to school. It is not just a different placement. You're being put into an extremely hostile environment that is not friendly, that is not supportive. It's actually pretty frightening. All kids, I mean, this is, you know, I'm shooting for the moon, but all kids should get a clinical care immediately. All kids. And then what should happen is you should determine the level of care that those kids need as you move forward and say, these kids may not need any. There are kids who definitely don't. But not, let's wait and see what goes wrong until we decide let's give them some clinical support. For discipline, and this is, in Texas was really what I focused on was number one, and we got this to work. We got that long-term placement was eliminated. No, it wasn't possible. They shut down the entire unit. The second sort of sanction where you saw the woman teaching the behavior management, which could last up to 90 days, that was eliminated. So it was no longer allowed to do that. We weren't able to get this idea of secluding the kids for 1 minute or 1 day or 2 days. They still were doing this as a form of punishment. But then to implement some pro-social behavioral interventions. And then the last is just that in education, you need to do an assessment when the kid arrives. You need to do child finding. If you aren't familiar with that, that means we must go out and find kids who have disabilities. We can't wait for them to find us. We need to use our data, and we can say, this kid likely has a disability, they need extra service. In Texas, we were also successful in getting a state law to provide reading instruction 90 minutes a day for any kid who was identified as having reading needs. That's a state law down there now, and it's the only state that has that. That should be mandatory. Full implementation of behavior supports. And then I think a big one, and it's not just on education really, but to have an ombudsperson who represents the kids and who comes in and monitors these things and says, you aren't doing this. And that's what they did in Texas as part of the lawsuit. It was a very effective model. In fact, that model has been kind of exported to other places. Okay, sorry, I went over. Travis, you're up next?
Yeah, I actually made a couple of changes, so I think I'm just going to plug in real quick. And
you were working while I was talking?
I wasn't working. I was producing while listening. I'm on the tenure track. This is part of I must be able to do that.
That's real hubris there.
I hope I didn't.
I'm only going to give you 10 minutes.
But I didn't hurt your feelings.
You did.
We rode together up here from Bermuda, so.
What's your
Oh, so I'm sure I'll get an earful in the car on the way back.
Yeah, because I drove.
Right. So I'm an assistant professor of special education at UMass, and my expertise and experience is in the education and treatment of children with severe disabilities, primarily kids with autism and intellectual disabilities. And so I've had some years of experience working in the public schools. Prior to that, I did some home-based intervention stuff for young children with autism. And even now, while I'm an assistant professor, I'm spending a day, roughly a day and a half every week in the public schools, working alongside teachers and administrators and consulting with them and giving them guidance on supporting their students with severe disabilities. And when I came to Massachusetts from Las Vegas, I'm a native of Las Vegas, and working in the public schools there, I thought the funding for education there is quite low. It's consistently in the bottom 3 or 4 states, sometimes at the bottom of the list for per pupil expenditure for public education. So coming to Massachusetts, for me, I thought, oh, I'm going to the land of the land of educators, the land where everyone values education, where they do it right. They do it right in Massachusetts, and that's going to be not just great for my children, but it's going to be great as an experience to go see what it's like to work in kind of a cutting edge state. And I was somewhat surprised and disappointed to see that there were many problems that were much worse here in Massachusetts than in Las Vegas, particularly around the use of exclusion or separate facilities, institutionalization, residential placement for students who have severe disabilities. It makes sense given the tradition, and then much of that kind of originated in New England institutions and sending your children away to school. So I think some of it has to do with culture, but nevertheless, there still exists a clear indicator of separateness, segregation, apartheid, use whatever word you like, particularly around kids who have severe disabilities and behavior problems. The kids who, you can have an intellectual disability or some other severe disability, and if you don't have serious problem behavior, then, the school is happy to keep you there. The moment there are severe problem behaviors, destructive behavior, aggressive behavior, self-injurious behavior, anything that warrants restraint, schools are eager to move that child to a more restrictive setting. And usually that means out of district. So really what you see is not just the use of exclusion, or restrictive educational settings, but also an emphasis on academic performance that I think is kind of the product of this culture of, that we've gotten with No Child Left Behind, and this emphasis on academic performance and teacher accountability as measured by student academic performance. So an emphasis on those academic skills and a neglect of communication skills, social skills, daily living skills, behavior supports. These things become secondary, and the main priority is evidence of academic development. There also is in public schools a very strong and consistent culture of conformity and compliance. Schools are about kids doing what grown-ups tell them. And whenever there is a kid who doesn't follow that rule, that kid becomes a problem for the school. Now, I would argue that it's the school's problem and that they need to change, but when you're operating on a day-to-day and you're an administrator who has, no education regarding students with disabilities, minimal knowledge and understanding of special education law, and really no skills to support teachers who are working with these students, it's easy to revert back to those things that are familiar, like kids not following directions, kid is, has problem behavior, this kid can't be in our school, this kid needs to go somewhere else. There's also a culture of low expectations. If you have a severe disability, well, there's not much that we can teach you, there's not much that you're going to learn, we can work on some basic academic stuff, and it tends to look very traditional, paper, pencil-based kind of learning. And in the end, the main problem, I think, is just lack of teacher accountability for student performance. So I want to get into a little more details about each one of those. This emphasis on academics actually contributes to problem behavior because the students are consistently asked to do things that are boring, that are too lengthy or too difficult, that are repetitive and meaningless to them, such as learning the value of coins by counting images of coins on a worksheet, for example. All right? There's no real understanding or connection between the task itself and the actual utility of that task. And so the task becomes all about completing it. And the teacher thinks that, yes, I'm teaching the student how to count money, but in reality, the student is only learning what he's supposed to do in order to finish this task. What do you want me to do, and how can I make you go away? And sometimes you get compliance that's maintained by escape from a demand. In other words, a kid does what he's supposed to simply because he wants to be done with it and knows that the teacher will not remove the demand until the task is complete. But in many cases, you get problem behavior that are maintained by escape. Kids will flop on the floor, or they'll become aggressive, or they will run out of the room, or they'll become self-injurious, or scream, or destroy materials. So the response usually is that that kid needs punishment, that kid needs discipline, that kid needs to be, suspended or excluded, or he needs to learn that this is how it's going to be, compliance and conformity. And the only method that many of these people have to turn to are these traditional approaches to managing behavior using discipline, punitive discipline and exclusion as a means of trying to control the student's behavior, and they're usually unsuccessful. So I have an example of a story of a student that I've been consulting the school district on. He's an 8th grade student who attends a day program in Western Massachusetts. He has low IQ. There's some, they're not sure if he has an autism spectrum disorder or not. There's some conflicting reports. He has a very complicated history, but he has some serious problem behavior, destructive behavior, self-injurious behavior, disruptive behavior, sometimes aggression towards staff. And he had an incident in the summertime where he broke a window by punching it. He punched a window, and it was one of those reinforced windows that has the little metal wires in it. And so the school, this is a school for kids who have serious behavior problems. The school's response was, this kid needs to go to residential. And you can see, this is just how it works. Starts at the general ed class, and that kid he's too disruptive, he can't be here in the early elementary years. He's sent to some separate classroom in the elementary school until his behavior becomes no longer manageable or controllable. And as it gets older and bigger and stronger and the behaviors become increasingly problematic, you move down this continuum to a separate facility, then day school, then residential, and so on, hospitalization. So the school was suggesting that he be moved to a residential facility, but they were convening a meeting to do this in the absence of any formal behavior supports, including those that are mandated by special education law. So they're attempting to circumvent the law, a very obvious portion of the law, and I told the school district, this is a bad idea. Sure, it might be an immediate solution to everyone's problems, but we're violating this kid's rights if we do this, and it could come back to you, and I'm not going to support it. And so we went into this meeting, and it was a very contentious meeting. But in the end, we ended up doing functional assessment. I spent an entire week doing some intense observation and reviewing his files and doing a comprehensive evaluation of his behavior to kind of find the things that I suspected. His behavior was maintained by escape from what really were just crappy academic tasks. I don't want to do this work, get me out of here. And some of it was also to get the attention of a preferred teacher and sometimes a peer. But they're not taking this functional perspective of behavior. They rely on these mentalistic explanations. They use the mental health problem as the explanation of behavior, and then so the student's behavior is attributed to the mental health, and then there is an absolving of responsibility by the school to do anything about that person's behavior. Because how can they change the person's mental health condition? So this is, I think, a pretty classic case of how poor academic content and instruction motivates inappropriate behavior that's maintained by escape from the demand. And then punishment or exclusion for those inappropriate behaviors or lack of appropriate action by the school is the kid goes to a more restrictive setting until they're no longer capable of going, until they reach the end of the line and they end up in a place like prison. Okay? And you can't go any further than that. Another problem, low expectations. Kids with severe disabilities are often viewed as needing our help. And so there's this attitude of helping kids that is actually detrimental to their development and independence. By giving them help all the time, they learn to become reliant on another person. And in Las Vegas, I had 13 students. One year I had 13 students, and I had one paraprofessional, myself and one paraprofessional, 13 students with autism. In a public school. And I was grateful to have that one paraprofessional. Here in Massachusetts, or even probably, not here in Massachusetts, but in Massachusetts and probably throughout New England, this is the use of one-to-one paraprofessionals is so pervasive, it's mind-boggling. The solution to every problem is let's put another adult on that kid, eyes on at all times, as if it's a good idea to take a person who has limited or no education about how to support students with severe disabilities, who's not prepared, has no skills, and give the most underqualified person in the school the responsibility of treating and educating the student with the most specialized needs. So this is an ethical problem, but it's a reflective of these low expectations. Oh, we just need someone to control them and keep them quiet so they're not disruptive. When a student has a severe disability, that becomes an explanation for why they shouldn't be in public schools. And in the 4th grade girl at the moment, the teacher who was working in a classroom for kids with severe disabilities didn't realize that the child could read. And she was in 4th grade, and the mother finally took a video of the girl at home reading on grade level, and sent the video to school. And then the teacher was finally believed it, but was shocked. There's also this culture of conformity and compliance, that students who have severe problem behavior need to be sent to more restrictive environments. And I had a little girl she wasn't little actually, she was an 8th grader with Down syndrome. She was disrobing in the public school, in the middle school. She would often urinate on the floor while disrobed. She would take her clothing and put it in the urine and then throw it at people. And so they started kind of preventing some of this by getting her into the bathroom, but then she would put her clothes in the toilet and throw them at people while they were in the bathroom. And so their response was to call crisis, send this kid to the hospital. There was all of this movement around sending her to a more restrictive environment. I came in, and within 2 weeks I had that girl completely turned around, and she's doing academic and other tasks in the classroom. This specialized education, but it was absent because the school valued doing what you're told when you're told to do it. And I think the last important piece is that there's no accountability. There are teachers who get these positions working for these kids, and they're not qualified. They're poorly prepared. They're hired on a waiver, a license waiver, because the schools can't find somebody who's qualified to do this. So they hire these people with no training, and then they expect the teacher to put together this portfolio or some other alternative assessment to demonstrate student progress, and those are usually lacking in rigor and content. So you have a lot of worksheet-based stuff because the teacher believes I got to have something to put in this portfolio, so they do money-related math worksheets and put those in the student portfolio as evidence that the student is learning how to use money. And that's widespread. That's everywhere I go. That's what people are doing. They're getting these worksheets and putting them in. And when the student doesn't make adequate progress, it's not because the teacher was ineffective. It's because that student has a very severe and complicated disability, and that's the reason why they're not learning. Okay, so there's really no accountability there. And we have lots of evidence of this. We have decades of poor post-school outcomes for students with disabilities. Decades of research that says these kids, when they leave school, they have poor outcomes. They're not employed, they don't live independently, they don't go out into the community, they're dependent on government support and other agencies. Their quality of life is very much diminished. We have disparate application of punitive discipline and suspension, as we saw in Michael's presentation. We have this continued culture of punitive discipline in place of a supportive and educational approach, teaching kids what to do rather than teaching them what not to do. We tell kids don't do that all day long instead of telling them what to do. An absence of evidence-based practices in school. We have empirical interventions that are effective for teaching these students, but they're not in place, and teachers are not held accountable when they're not using those methods or interventions. And we have no consensus on how to reliably evaluate the educational progress of students with severe disabilities. We have methods for progress monitoring, but on a large scale, statewide assessment. We don't have anything that can accurately demonstrate the student making progress in a way that makes the teacher accountable. It's data collection for data's sake. Just a couple of other things really quickly. This is a picture of the representation of autism across the country over time, and we compared these different racial groups to the white group. And the striking trend here, just want to point out, African Americans were overrepresented in the autism category in the early years and have become increasingly underrepresented in the autism category in recent years. I think some of that has to do with the availability of high quality services, and that they're actually being given to, more available to white students than African American or Hispanic students. So this is just a different figure that shows the same thing. Widespread underrepresentation of students with autism across the United States. So I'll stop there. What's that?
That's not why I stopped.
Yeah, it is disturbing.
It hasn't changed much.
It hasn't, and that's part of the frustration. Is that just these are not new. This is not news. We've known these things for decades, and they continue to happen. They're just problems that we ignore. While Michael's setting up, I'll just comment that we still don't collect information about race according to disability and placement. So we don't know who's excluded in these racial categories for specific disabilities.
Yeah, I'm gonna can I add one quick thing, because I think this is a real problem. So if you work with either identification, and you're talking about either over or under identification, if you focused on things like school discipline over or under identification, states have I would say it's abused the IDEA, which says, oh, you know what, we have to protect confidentiality, so small groups, we can't give you that information about them.
Right.
So what you find is all of the kids who have emotional disturbance and whom are minorities are a subgroup, and so they're never big enough to ever report on. All of the kids who are have autism and let's say they're also a minority student, they're in a subcategory that we don't need to report we don't need to report those outcomes on academic performance, disciplinary performance, or even identification. We don't even need to say that they've been identified. And so what you do is the state will provide you aggregate data, but then you can't understand what's really happening. That's a real problem. And it's this idea that the civil protections under the IDEA undermine the support of these kids. The kids who need the most support are undermined by the notion that we need to protect their identities,
right,
at a cost of actually serving them. And I think it's a real problem.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's good points. Are you?
You want to? I don't know. I can't.
Oh. I have a pass for my kids, that's why. I put a little passcode lock on it, otherwise my battery would be dead.
So my name is Molly Faulkner-Bond, and I'm going to talk about English learners in U.S. schools. In my presentation, I'm going to start by just giving a brief overview of who these students are, and then I'm going to talk about sort of the context and some challenges in 3 different areas: instruction, policy, and assessment, not that order, and then some takeaways. I'm going to use the word English learner to refer to these students. You may have also heard English language learner, limited English proficient is language that's in the law, or sometimes people say ESL for English as a second language. EL is sort of the preferred nomenclature these days, so that's what I'm going to use, but a lot of these terms are related. So who are English learners? This is the federal definition of an English learner. I'm not going to expect you guys to read all this. The main point here is that it's very complicated. You'll see there's 4 clauses, A, B, C, and D, and a number of sub-clauses under those. So what this is basically saying is an English learner is a student. That's what A and B cover. It's a student who meets 1 of 2 criteria. They either have a native language other than English, or they were born and raised in an environment where they were unlikely to learn English correctly or at all. And, so you have to meet 1 of the first 2. If you meet those, you also have to have actual English proficiency problems that create barriers to your success in school or in life. So the important thing to recognize here is the emphasis on actual language. It's not enough just to have a non-native language to be an English learner. You also need to demonstrate that you have problems with language that are creating issues for you in school and in life. Nationwide, there's about 4.5 million English learners. That's about 10% of the overall K-12 population. They live in all 50 states. Though they are heavily concentrated, so roughly 2/3 of the English learners nationwide are condensed in the 5 states that have the largest PL populations. Probably not surprising: California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Illinois. The vast majority of English learners speak Spanish. 43 states plus the District of Columbia report Spanish as their most frequently spoken language among English learners, though it is important to remember that there is diversity within that group. So an English learner from Puerto Rico probably speaks Spanish differently from an English learner from El Salvador or Colombia. And I also emphasize that there's a lot of diversity within the English learner group. So despite the fact that most of them live in these high-incidence states and speak Spanish, they speak overall almost 100 languages within the group. They come from every socioeconomic background. They may or may not be literate in their home language. They may have had formal education interruptions or not. And I think we tend to think of them as often immigrants, young students who speak Spanish, came from Mexico and live in the United States, but none of these things are actually related to the definition of an English learner. So I think over half of the English learners in the US were born in this country. They're not necessarily immigrants. They're not all Hispanic, not all young, and being an English learner does not mean that you have disabilities. There's no reason you can't learn academic content just because you can't speak English. So they're not less capable in academic content areas, but you wouldn't know that to look at any of the data in this area. So this is one example. This is the National Assessment of Education Progress, 8th grade math from 2011, actually from a number of years. And what this is showing with the orange bars is that every year since 1996, at least 2/3 of the English language learner subgroup have been below basic, the lowest performance category on this assessment. That's the exact opposite trend you see in the population overall, where 2/3 or more are in basic or above. So these students are disproportionately represented at the low end of the academic performance on a test that measures math, apparently.
But basic is not proficient.
Yes, that's true. So in terms of the policy affecting English learners, there are, it's sort of a morass. A lot of people know that No Child Left Behind obviously dictates most of the education policy right now, and Title III specifically addresses English learner education. But for this group, there's actually a lot more to it than that. So in addition to Title III, English learners are sort of protected and affected by the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Has been used in a lot of federal court cases to defend these students. Also the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is designed to prevent discrimination on the basis of race, language, or national origin. Courts have ruled that language is a proxy for national origin, so to discriminate against a student on the basis of language is the same as discriminating against them on the basis of their national origin. The Equal Educational Opportunity Act of 1974, which reinforces a lot of the same ideas from Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, but specifically in the realm of education. And then there are a lot of state-specific laws. So California and Massachusetts both have laws which more or less require the use of English-only education as opposed to bilingual. Some states have rules about how long you can be an English learner or what the criteria are to stop being an English learner. So in terms of challenges in the policy area, obviously a big one is just making sure people are aware that this is bigger than just NCLB. There's a lot of laws here, and everyone needs to be aware of them because even something as mundane as the way a teacher teaches a class in a particular classroom relates to whether or not these laws are being enforced properly. Teachers may not be aware of that, though. School administrators may not be aware of that. So it's important that everyone realizes how complex this is. It's also not always clear what these laws ultimately recommend. So they all need to be followed, but in terms of what that means you should do, it's not always clear. It varies from case to case, and a lot of it has to do with balancing resources, balancing equity, and really meeting the needs of your particular population of ELs, which may be very different from the needs of a different population of ELs. And obviously integrating all these laws. They're supposed to work in harmony, but there are times when they do seem to be in conflict with each other, and that again takes a lot of judgment and awareness on the part of policymakers and teachers. In terms of instruction, districts face two different requirements. So first of all, you're supposed to teach English learners English. It's supposed to be a temporary designation where you get the kids up to speed so that they stop having a special status and they can just go participate in regular academic instruction along with peers who have spoken English their whole lives. So you have to teach English learners English. And the laws require that you have a program that's evidence-based, whatever that means. You have to implement it with full and adequate resources so that you're really giving it a fighting chance to work, and you need to evaluate it to make sure it's meeting those goals. For academic content instruction, the laws require that you can't segregate English learners just because they're English learners. You can't put them in some kind of dead-end track where they learn English, and then if they do that, that's great, you're done, never mind about history. You can't classify them as special education status just because of their language disabilities. It's different. So in terms of challenges in this area, obviously a big question is, well, how should we do this? Well, how should we teach English learners English? Is it better to teach them in a bilingual setting, an English-only setting? And actually what I've seen in the literature is that's a question everyone's really worried about. How do we teach English learners English? Very few people are asking, how do we teach English learners history? Not a focus, but that's important, and how should it be done? Another big area is making sure that you have qualified instructors to teach these students. People also forget, I think, that an English learner spends most of his or her day in regular classes at school. So it's great if you have a wonderful language teacher, and you should have a wonderful language teacher, but the history teacher and the science teacher and the English language arts teacher and the math teacher also all need to know how to teach these students. And it's starting to change now, but a lot of teacher preparation programs don't really prepare teachers for that. So making sure that they're ready, because you do need to do special things for these students, is a big lift. And finally, how do we evaluate the program? So how bad is bad enough to say this probably isn't working, we should do something else? How fast is fast enough to say, yeah, we're getting these students ready, they're exiting on time? How do you balance language instruction with content instruction? Those are all open questions that need research to support them. And finally, in terms of assessments, under No Child Left Behind, English learners take 2 kinds of assessment every year. So all English learners in grades K to 12 must participate in a language proficiency assessment to see whether they're making progress towards learning English. In addition to that, they have to participate in the content instructions that are mandated for all students in reading and math in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. And this is an important point. They can't be excluded from those content instructions just because they don't speak English. And that can sometimes seem counterintuitive, but the reasoning behind that actually goes back to what Michael was saying, that people used to just exclude them from these assessments, and so then we had no idea how these kids were doing. They were way below grade level or didn't know anything at all, but it didn't matter because it wasn't in the numbers. And similarly, now that you have to disaggregate their performance when you report for NCLB, so you can see, you can make charts like the one I showed before, say these students are actually way behind their fluent peers. And now we can see that because we have these numbers. There's one exception, that if you're a new immigrant who's been in the country for less than a year, you can be excluded from the language arts assessment your first year, but that's it. And the other important thing is that you can't test English learners at a lower grade level than the one they're in. So just because they don't speak English well, you can't give a 5th grade English learner a 3rd grade science assessment, because what we want to know is, did they learn the curriculum in the 5th grade science class? So that's what we need to test them on. So obviously a big area for research in the assessment area is accommodations. These are supports that you give a student during the assessment that try to reduce the language burden so that all that's left, they can really show what they know only with respect to the content without the language getting in the way. Things are getting better in this area. At first, people really just kind of used accommodations that have been designed for students with disabilities and said, well, here you go, English learners, try that, see if it helps. There's been a move now towards approaching this similarly to the way it is for students with disabilities, where you have a team of adults who are making decisions for English learners based on the individual needs and how to make sure that student can show what they know and can do. Still, something we need to figure out is how to really interpret the content performance of ELs. So is this really telling us that ELs are bad at math, or is this telling us that ELs are bad at English and the math test was in English? And what should we do with the scores if they mean one or the other, and how would we tell? Another one is, how do we decide that an English learner has reached an appropriate level of language proficiency that they're ready to exit? And obviously a lot of ongoing research about accommodations. You want an accommodation to help an English learner and make no difference for a non-English learner, and you want it to not change the underlying construct that the assessment is actually about. So always need evidence for that. So in terms of takeaways, definitely the thing I always emphasize is to remember that this is a diverse group. The only thing they have in common is that their language creates problems for them to perform in school. It doesn't mean anything else about them in terms of their background. English learners may be more different from each other than they are from the general population, so it's always important to think about them as individuals and make sure that you're addressing their needs as individuals. And obviously it's starting to become complicated. There's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of different challenges that all need to be balanced, and even though there's a lot of great research going on, there's still a lot of unanswered questions, so it requires sort of constant vigilance. And the theme that I always think of in thinking about this population is that all of our biggest challenges are really about balancing these two opposing things. So if you think about it in terms of instruction, what we're trying to do on the one hand is make sure that we're really hitting hard on the language instruction to try and get these kids out of this status as fast as we can. So you really want to make sure they're learning language. But at the same time, let's make sure that they're not falling behind in their content courses. We want them to be keeping up so that if they want to take AP Calculus, they'll be in that position when the time comes. So how do you make sure that you're doing both of those things adequately without privileging one over the other? In terms of reclassifying ELs, getting them out of this status, obviously you want that to happen as quickly as possible, because the longer you stay in that status, it can really start to affect the classes you can take, your performance, the quality of your instruction. At the same time, if you get kids out too soon and they go into content classes, if they still have language needs that are not being addressed, they're not going to do well, and they'll continue to lag behind, and now they don't have any of the supports that they had when they were identified as an English learner. And finally, in terms of expectations, obviously the big move for NCLB was one set of standards, all kids. Let's make sure that we're not holding English learners to lower standards just because they can't speak English properly. And that's been generally a good thing. I think a lot of advocates feel that it's important to make sure that we are giving these kids a chance to show what they can do. But at the same time, we want to be realistic. You know, is it realistic to think that these kids can score advanced on this English language arts assessment if they haven't learned the language properly? And should we think about setting different performance criteria or using other measures to evaluate their performance in light of that fact? So that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay. So you don't need this?
No, I don't.
Turn this off. Now you get 17 minutes.
Oh, boy. Thank you. My name is Madeline Peters, and I'm the Director of Disability Services at the University of Massachusetts. I've worked there for 22 years. I've been on campus for about 30 years. I got my education in the School of Education at UMass. Just recently graduated with my doctorate in 2010. And I'm here today to talk about fairness and disability in higher education. Now, I didn't put together a PowerPoint because I think it's important to talk about the language that we use and how we describe people with disabilities and the ways that we have ideas of what they should and shouldn't be able to do. So when I was thinking about putting this together last night, I started looking at the definition of fairness because I have a problem with that word. And what it said is it's just or conforming with the rules. And when we talk about creating fairness or equating it with the definition of the same or equal. So, as you know, when we grew up as children, our parents would want to make sure we treated our siblings fair. So to be fair, we'd each get the same size piece of cake. Okay, that's fair. Except for your brother went back and stole the rest, and there was no more left for anybody. But that was sort of where we got the definition of fairness. Not that it meant staying inside the lines, not that it meant being inside a boundary that's created in a particular way, being inside a particular box. So to make our lives easier as educators, when doing curriculum design, what we have done is we have designed for the majority of people, quote unquote. The thought or idea that we as educators may have an individual in the classroom that learns differently or than the way that we know how to teach is an insult or an assault on our individual representation and ability to educate. As professors, teachers, educators, as we teach students to become teachers, we are still not educating from the perspective of inclusiveness. We're educating for those in the field who we have created the curriculum. We hope that we will never have to rewrite it. We go home, make our curriculum, or we've done our dissertation, and hopefully that will last a very long time. At one of my conferences, I said to a teacher, well, you know, are you going to redesign your curriculum? And he said, you think I'm going to go home every time I have a different student in my classroom and rewrite the curriculum for that one individual student? So what we look at is we have 30 students coming through a classroom whatever many years a teacher has been teaching in the classroom, and they all adjust and go through that classroom, except for 3 or 4 students on vacation that fail the class. So who is the actual failure here? Is it the teacher or is it the student? The Individuals with Disability Act states that students with disabilities are to receive a free and appropriate education. Appropriate, suitable, or fit for a particular individual. Okay? So what that means is that we have to create and design the curriculum for the individual that has the need, freely and appropriately. The Americans with Disability Act states that all programs and services and activities will be accessible to all people with disabilities. So what does that mean? How do we make services and activities accessible to all people? So when we talk about accessible to all people, where does the word fairness come in? The word equal is not mentioned. Appropriate for an individual, not one size fits all. As a parent, you have 2 children, one 3-month-old and one 5-year-old. To be fair, the definition which is used in defining people with disability, would you feed both children equally? The fact that the only way an infant can receive nourishment is through the formula and a toddler through table food. The fairness in that each child is receiving nourishment so that they may survive. This is the definition that we use in creating accommodations for people with disabilities. We're not looking at what that student has or what all the students in the classroom have. What we're looking at is what does this individual student need. But as we go through, and I was very impressed with both your presentations, because what it's telling you is that we can't create something different for the individual that has the need. We want them to fit into what we've already created so we don't have to recreate. And then if they don't fit in, then they end up incarcerated, or they end up in special classrooms or boarding schools, etc. At the university, we don't follow that, people get pushed out, we keep them in. But I'm going to get to that in a minute. So what I'm saying is that accessibility is treating people with disabilities equally. It is treating each person as an individual and ensuring that each individual's needs are being met. We work with individuals on a case-by-case basis. We can't say that we have 7 people with cerebral palsy and they would all need the same accommodation. What we have to look at is, what do you need? What do you need? What do you need? And it's a quick learning, it's a very quick learning. Coming from social justice, where we sort of put everybody into a group and we say, well, this is for all the women want this, and all the men want this, and all the people of color want this, and we determine that, so we're being socially just and diverse by creating this atmosphere, but yet we're not looking at individual needs. And as we go through time, we'll see how we stumble over those things when we're trying to figure out why all the Chinese students didn't come to the Chinese New Year's that we spent all this time putting together. So as a member of our society, from a historical perspective, we have grouped people based on our similarities. And that was more to divide and conquer. This modality has served us well as we have pushed individuals through the education system basically to catch up with the Russians when they set the Sputnik up to the moon. They did it first, we're in trouble. What are we going to do? Well, let's see. Let's get our best and brightest up to the top. We'll put the other ones down the bottom. There's your tracking system. Now, many people from earlier, or I would say later generations, aren't familiar with the tracking systems, but that was something very much alive and well in this area of Massachusetts when I was growing up. So what the goal was to get everybody out there so that they would become engineers, mathematicians, etc. And so what we had was division between upper class and poor. And the difference between disability and the other categories of socialization, such as race, is that the individuals who belong to the other diverse groups can fit in the classroom without having to change the curriculum. Although diversifying the curriculum would be a nice thing to do, to introduce other pieces of history and information that meets the needs of all the students in the classroom, rather than just one particular group of students in the classroom. However, as more and more individuals with disabilities are integrated into quote-unquote the regular classroom, the demands for educators has grown for more universal design classrooms, which means educators would have to change how they teach curriculum, design classes, and become aware of the needs of individuals with disabilities. Not only from a curricular design, but architectural design. Due to the lack of diverse thinking by the mainstream scientists and engineers before the ADA, all buildings, including housing and educational institutions, are not accessible, and the cost is above reproach in some buildings for renovation. So currently we have individuals who are quadriplegics that don't have homes to live in unless they have them renovated. And if you think about, going into a house and lowering all the cabinets and lowering the faucets and the sinks, and that's not anything anybody can afford. The area we live in, houses run for $265,000, $300,000. You're going to do another $100,000 worth of renovations? That's not possible. And there's no government programs or anything that would offer people the access to housing. At the campuses, what we find is that, all right, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit. In accordance with the ADA, all people with disabilities are to have access to all programs, services, and activities in higher ed. The biggest problem is implementing the accommodation, and that the biggest problem is implementing accommodations to physical space. Okay, so we have buildings on campus that were built probably in the 1800s, some of those buildings. And those are some of the buildings that have been closed down at our particular campus. But buildings before 1970 and before are not accessible and have been built in a way that it's very hard to go in and create the type of accessibility we would need for individuals to get into the buildings. So what we do is we take the student and the program and move that to a building that's accessible. Now, that could be very easy, except for when we have one particular building, we have 2 or 3 classrooms that hold 300 students. That building is not accessible. We don't have 2 or 3 300 classes in other buildings, okay? And so it's hard to move. We're currently building on campus, and all of the disability service providers will be outside celebrating when the new classroom building is finally finished, because that will give us that larger classroom. So we get, innovative and create independent studies. We try to get a smaller section that's in a different building. So we work with the faculty to try to get things changed. I think that the other thing is that there's cracks in sidewalks. There's living in New England, the asphalt breaks whenever it gets cold, cracks, and so we have a lot of issues like that where we're trying to go out and fix cracks in the sidewalk. But mostly, I would say, in reference to what's most difficult in higher education is that mobility issues. Academic accommodations are pretty standard. We provide documentation conversion, classroom access assistance, sign language interpretation, note takers, proctored exams, adaptive technology. So what you have for people that are needing accommodations in the classroom, they're pretty clear to be able to come into the office and say, what is the office that provides that as disability services? And they're on, all public institutions do have a disability service office. A lot of the private schools may have a dean that's the ADA disability person and the dean of students or something like that. And so what we have is the office provides the services and basically serves the campus, the faculty and staff. So the question also was, what do we want from the faculty and staff? We want people to adapt more universal curriculum design. And they're usually pretty cooperative. As time goes by, people become more and more aware of the rights and needs of people with disabilities. By integrating the universal design, we won't have as many issues created as we have in the past. We have more and more people coming in with very unique types of disabilities, which you cannot prepare for because you don't know until they get there. And once they're there, we just sit down and put our heads together and try and figure out what we're going to do. But the goal is to accommodate. It's not to be fair. It's to make sure everybody gets what they need. And sometimes somebody needs more than somebody else, and that's fair.
Okay, so we have plenty of time for, I've never seen everybody actually finish on the time.
Not just,
We still have 2 minutes.
We're very disciplined.
So we have a lot of time for questions. I did want to just, there was one, Madeline made one really interesting point. I think she was talking about fairness, and she said, oh, you know, we've created an educational system for the majority. And as she said that, I thought to myself that if we look at the problems that we're talking about here from the diverse learners face, okay, we talk about, in that model, we're talking about kids with learning problems, kids with behavior problems, kids with cognition problems, kids with language problems. And at one point I said, and really as I was thinking, I wrote down, I said, this presupposes that we did it right for the majority. And I think that's the faulty assumption. That what really needs to happen is we need to consider again what we thought when we said, here's what science is. You know, I would argue when I go and look, I mean, I've been working this I run an after-school program for kids with emotional disturbance in Holyoke High School, and I spend almost no time in schools. So I'm a sort of a rare special educator that I don't know much about public education. I only know what happens to the kids who weren't successful there. And I watch the classrooms and I think, nobody is benefiting from this approach.
No.
Everybody is benefiting minimally. And I think we've instead of saying what we've done is we're teaching to the majority, we've assumed that if the majority minimally benefits, that's good enough.
Right.
And I think that may be our problem.
Right.
You know, and if we simply did things, you know, if you think about what Jason was talking about, or Molly was talking about, or what Mel was talking about, and said, let's just design everything that way and really take universal design and really talk about how do we really do this, you suddenly wouldn't spend so much time accommodating.
Exactly.
And there's just no evidence to say that the kid who is, you know, by whatever measure we say this is going to be our top performer, wouldn't benefit more in that model as well. So anyways, I thought it was an interesting idea. So any questions can be directed to whoever. I'm not going to stand up here and just ask whoever you want to ask. Yeah.
Hi. Oh. I appreciated everybody's presentation. I'm actually a new faculty member at UMass in the College of Ed. And I wanted to ask, I'm familiar with the process in K through 12. If you have a student with special needs, or as a teacher, you might identify a student who you might want to get a consult on. But I wonder, what's that process like in higher ed if the student has identified themselves with the Disability Services Office, since they are able to do that as adults now?
Right.
So as a faculty member, if you notice something, or there are clear signs to something, and you're not the only one involved in the process, clearly the student's taking other classes, and things are starting to happen across classes, I don't know if you have suggestions.
What options?
Yeah.
First of all, we work with a lot of the people that have been identified as a person with a disability. And there's the standard procedure of registering, intake form, bringing your documentation. And once you're registered, that opens the door to services. If you have someone that you're feeling like they might have a disability, or that there's something going on, you're sort of picking up different things in the classroom, you can always call the office and The issue is that the student's not documented. And so if the student's willing, you know, we could steer them in the right direction to get testing and to get documentation. And it sounds like you're probably talking about maybe a student that may have a learning disability. And unfortunately, students with learning disabilities have to pay for their own testing. We're still working with the insurance, insurance
Now,
companies.
here is here is an area where we could help you.
Okay.
This is an area where we could get you support without really having to pay for it. We've been planning. There's something like, we have people who do testing all the time.
I've been all day.
We're trying how do we collaborate? We're saying, we have special education and disability services, and we do very little together. I mean,
Right.
so,
Right.
Anyways.
Yeah,
Sorry.
because that's where we run into the problem, and it takes a very long time.
Yeah.
And by the time the student gets tested, you were the faculty, 2 years ago, and so that's the problem I see with people with learning disabilities. Other disabilities are pretty easy to get diagnosed and get registered and get moving right away, but that one is the one that we have the most problem with.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But we're there to help you and help students. We're both dual roles. We help you to make accommodations, and we help the student to get the accommodations.
Can I ask what your services are like for English learners with potential learning disabilities?
They're the same as for anybody. Now, if we have a person that doesn't quite understand English, maybe we would work to try and get somebody to work with them. We have a learning specialist, and so we would probably bring somebody in that could converse with the person in their second language or first language, so that they would understand better what they're trying to learn.
Can I piggyback on that? I'm curious because I know as part of admissions, oftentimes students have to take an exam that demonstrates that they're proficient in English before they can be admitted, or sometimes it's just considered what their performance is on that exam prior to admission. So, in some ways, that may not be a significant problem at the university, or not speculating here, because if they don't score, get a sufficient score, then they're not admitted.
They're not admitted, right?
Well, I'm familiar with that, being in the field, but I just know from being in higher ed classrooms with more international students of different abilities, whatever they get on TOEFL is just a test score of
Right.
how they're performing in the classroom over time with the amount of reading that's necessary and so forth. Sometimes it's difficult as a faculty member to distinguish between kids who need more time and kids who need extra support. So we don't have a very good answer to that for the places that I've been working on the West Coast.
Well, I don't feel that we do either. I don't know if you know more about it, because I don't even know that we used to have a program on campus for ESL program for people, but that was defunct a very long time ago. And I haven't really had people coming to me with English as a second language needing that type of assistance. So, if you said, what would I do? That if I had that opportunity, that is what I would do. But it doesn't happen very often.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, just to kind of, I teach a class where we're essentially is trying to create universally designed classrooms so that it's teaching special educators to understand curriculum essentially. I mean, I'm just thinking, I'm sure I have the same problem, because when somebody they do the TOEFL, fine, but then I give them reading that may, if you did a readability test, it's like 18. It's out of whack with what we said they needed to come in with. And if they have some actual, there's actually a learning barrier, that now, I'm just, screwing them from the beginning and giving them something that, without a learning problem, you'll have a hard time reading. Without a language problem, I think, I'm just thinking now, like, I assign these readings, and good Lord, what am I doing? But in that class, my students have to take a high school text, and they have to create 4 different adaptations of it at different readability levels. And I've had some gifted students who've gotten all of the main content down to say 4th grade level, high school biology text. And maybe, I mean, not that each faculty can do that, but I wonder if that may be something that you create a new model of looking at what's most important in the text. And maybe the faculty start saying, look, these are the critical elements of that text. Can you change this text so that these critical elements are there, there's something that they can hold on to and use as a resource, but aren't taxing both language and this learning area. Because it's the complexity of the sentences become, English is it's outrageous in the way.
Yeah, it's stupid money. Well, you see that too when students the students who they highlight, and they don't just highlight 1 or 2 lines on a page, like the whole page is highlighted. It's clear that they cannot differentiate between the most important elements and the less important details. They just think everything's important and they have to memorize it all. So.
I think that goes back to what Molly was saying about the content area testing. Sure, the kids that are designated as ELs are level 1, 2s, and 3s in the K-12s, and so I don't necessarily expect them to get all the word problems correct, but it does beg the question of how are the math teachers teaching? If we have kids that are gifted in math when they come into this country, and again, most ELs were born in the United States, over 50%, in California, 85%. It's scary. So they should all be doing pretty well in math since they've been in math programs their whole life. But it begs the question of how are we teaching content, not only to our English learners who are of some limited proficiency, but to our struggling readers in the K-12s and kids that are at risk for learning disabilities if they continue to not get what they need. It goes back to that fine line between linguistic competence and linguistic complexity for all people.
What do you mean by at-risk for learning disabilities?
So in the reading disability, learning disability areas, we talk about the educational learning disability, where it is a product of not having exposure or opportunity to learn the phonics, for example, or the building blocks of reading. And you can find kids who, if you tested them, would show up with the kind of scores that would indicate a learning disability. But they do not show kind of the cognitive, on the cognitive test that they would be, for example, having dyslexia. If you apply some intervention, like a tier 2 intervention, not a tier 3 intervention, you would find that they would get back on track to get up to speed. But it's very difficult in the English learner population to differentiate between, what was a result of lack of education.
Right. I had a question for you because when you had that chart, you talked about emotional disabilities were one of the highest, but underneath there you had learning disabilities, which was at 44%. And I just think what's starting to happen in our society is we're starting to discount the number of people with learning disabilities, and I think that what we're doing is we're not really taking into consideration the seriousness of that disability. And I'm feeling like educators have, all right, that was a pretty good disability in the 80s, and now we're moving to autism and intellectual disabilities because we really don't know what to do with those kids. And what you find is there's a high percentage of those kids incarcerated because they're impulsive, they make poor decisions, they're trying to show people that they can do things well. So it's like, yeah, I can do drugs, I can do all these different things because they're trying to show what they can do because society has told them that, well, you can't do this. And I just think that over time, as being the Director of Disability Services, what we saw was that everybody was coming in with a diagnosis of a learning disability. And then all of a sudden it switched to ADHD. And I'm looking at the documentation and I'm going, no, this is a learning disability. But we're going, but the doctor said it's ADHD, so we have to go with the ADHD, but we have to provide accommodations for the learning disability. And but it's like, okay, well, you can medicate ADHD. You can't do anything with these people with learning disabilities. Hopefully they'll graduate and then they won't have it anymore. But they still have it. So it's
the context.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because I sort of feel that that's starting to get neglected in the society.
I would say it's not starting to. I mean,
Well, it is.
Long term. And I always tell, if you work with the kids who I work with, I always say, somewhere in the 70s, there was, Time magazine focused on Down syndrome. Right? So when I was a kid, I remember this was a part of growing up. It was, and I remember there were like TV shows where there would be, characters on the show who actually had Down syndrome. And then it went to, it was like learning disabilities, and then it went to ADHD, and now we're in the autism. It's like, and you see people move into, I would rather have my child has autism, even, it doesn't, and I always say that you'll find them on time. Each decade or whatever has a new, and I always say, my kids will never be on the cover there. It's like, how to help these kids, the bad kids. And I think part of it is, I think one of the problems in this population is the kids with learning disabilities aren't getting served in school, and they're responding in the best, most efficient way possible. I'm going to do something to get myself out of that situation.
Right.
I feel like that teacher is making me feel like an idiot. I'll just tell them, fuck you.
Right.
Then I'll go to the office.
It looks
But I might not even get back there the next day, and then eventually I'll get back there. And a lot of this reason, those kids are just, I think it is, it's that there's processing problems, there's no, it's not thinking about, okay, here's my behavior, here's the consequence. It's not thinking about, I can predict and
well, I
follow
think
through
it's
these
like,
steps.
here's the issue. They're coming around and they're going to ask me to read in 2 minutes, and I'm not going to want to do this, so I'll smack the person in front of me, get kicked out of the classroom, and hopefully I won't ever go back.
The thing about that is oftentimes there's not even that processing happening, because the behavior has become just part of what the person's repertoire is. It's that a lot of the times you're behaving and you're doing things and you're not thinking about why you do them. The example I like to use is the elevator button. You walk over to the elevator, you press the button, you wait a few minutes, the elevator's not coming. And so what do you do next? You walk over to that button and you press it a bunch of times rapidly, like, come on, elevator. Now you're just behaving then. And when you laugh because you realize, yes, I've done that, and it doesn't make any sense that I've done that. I know the elevator, when I reflect on that, I know it's not going to make it skip floors or come faster or that the door is going to open. But behavior is just happening because of the history of that occurrence. And I think a lot of times with our kids, they're blamed for their behavior because we presume that they're acting intentionally, that this is like, I had this planned, it was going to be my turn, and I hit somebody, and now I'm getting sent away. Well, it may seem like that, it's not always the case. A lot of the times these things are just happening because it's part of what that person's repertoire of behavior is. And then we discriminate against that student. We blame them for their own, you made a bad choice, and you should not have hit that person, and now you can't be here and get out. And I think that's oftentimes what happens in schools.
I have a question. For the research that you're doing, aside from the taxis, I have some examples. What are there other institutions that are doing a better job taking into consideration some of the things?
Yeah, so some of the things so when I kind of talk about recommendations, we run out of time, but, I think I've been to now about 75 different institutions. And so so I talk about an entire state, right? And I say Texas, but within that Texas system, there are some places that do a better job than other places. There are some things that, in one place they do this one thing. There used to be in Delaware was a place called Ferris School. And I would say that's a model, except that the last time I was there was 7 years ago, and he's thinking he put in a new director, and I would never say again that was a good model. But they did just incredible work. In fact, when I went there, I couldn't believe it. I literally was like scratching my head, and I was thinking, how are they pulling this off? Because my experience in prisons had always been there like prisons.